The briefing is brought to you in association with Spain. From the wilds of the Atlantic to the warmth of Mediterranean isles, the Spanish coast has something for every occasion. And whether chartering a yacht or renting a more modest motorboat, there's no better way to explore this magical country's lesser-known highlights than from the open water. Listen out for a new summer season of The Concierge on Monocle Radio. Join Robert Bound and friends as they turn navigator for an unforgettable journey along the Spanish coast. From hidden gems to legendary gastronomy, and with the unique drama of the America's Cup in the host city of Barcelona added to the mix, discover why the time is right to take to the waves. The Concierge, returning to Monocle Radio in July. This summer, set sail for Spain.
You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 26th of August 2024.
Hello and welcome to The Briefing, coming to you live from Dufourstrasse 90 here in Zurich. I'm Emma Nelson, and coming up on today's programme, we'll have the latest as Russia mounts fresh assaults on Ukraine. We'll examine the next steps after Israel and Hezbollah exchange the heaviest fire in months. And also coming up, thousands take to the streets in protest at a power struggle between Indonesia's executive and the country's most powerful court. We'll also examine the rise of anti-war parties in Germany. Plus, Fernanda Augusta Pacheco joins me from London for the newspapers in Latin America. Faye, good afternoon. What do you have for us?
Good afternoon, Emma. Today we look at the state of regional aviation in Brazil and the changing format for the country's most celebrated newspaper.
Fernando, thank you. All that and more coming up right here on The Briefing with me, Emma Nelson, live from Zurich. What happens after this weekend's heavy exchange of fire between Israel and Hezbollah? With neither side openly seeking an escalation, is there scope now to refocus on the efforts to bring about a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas? Well, Alison Kaplan-Sommer is a journalist for Haaretz and joins me now on the line from Tel Aviv. A very good afternoon to you, Alison.
Hey, good afternoon, Emma.
Good to have you with us. Now, you, I imagine, would have woken up on Sunday morning to the news that there was a heavy air assault taking place against Hezbollah and that Hezbollah was launching an attack in response. But very soon there was a sense that all that had dissipated. Is that a correct assumption or assessment?
Well, yeah, the dissipation took a few hours. Everyone was sort of bracing, not quite knowing what the response would be to Israel's preemptive strike, massive preemptive strike against the thousands of missile launchers, which were supposed to be sending attacks into Israel. And most significantly, as was revealed, first in press reports and then confirmed by Hassan Nasrallah when he gave a speech yesterday evening, that some of the missiles were headed for a sensitive military base just north of Tel Aviv, really right over the border of Tel Aviv. And, knowing that potentially if that had happened, the results could have been very, very different. But so there was a sense of tension and worry and concern over what was going to happen, mostly during the morning and early hours of the day yesterday. And then by the afternoon, Hezbollah issued a statement saying that its operation for the revenge of the killing of Fouad Shukra almost a month ago was completed. And so then there was sort of a sigh of relief and a belief that we would go back to sort of the bad normal, which was sporadic attacks by rockets on northern Israel from Hezbollah, but nothing like the scale of the attack that was planned for Sunday morning.
So we have both Israel and Hezbollah saying we have, for the moment, drawn a line under things. But we're looking at reports in, foreign media, all very keen to react and add what they want to say. The Iranian foreign minister is warning of more to come. Iran is saying that Israel's deterrent power has been lost and that the strategic balance in the region has now shifted against it. I mean, what are your thoughts on those assessments?
Well, they're always saber rattling. From the beginning of this conflict, from October 7th, there's never been a time where, Hezbollah or Iran or any of the so-called axis of resistance wasn't threatening Israel and wasn't saying it was going to attack. So I'm not saying that it's something that you should shrug at, but it's not a new threat. And it's not only a threat, like this has been going on the whole time. The world's eyes have been on Gaza and what's happening there. But throughout this entire conflict, beginning on October 8th, there's been exchanges of fire between Hezbollah and between Israel. So there's nothing new. I'm not saying it's not disturbing, but it's kind of disturbing on the basis of it's been disturbing and it will continue to disturb.
Let's talk a little bit more about the attempts to try to bring about some sort of ceasefire. We have the United States doing what it can and sort of urging for a coming together. But earlier on today on the Globalist, there was a suggestion that those involved in the talks, the likes of Egypt and Qatar, are perhaps no longer the voices that are needed to make Israel and Hamas come together and talk properly and, most importantly, bring about a ceasefire. Do you think that that's an accurate assessment of, obviously these talks have been going on for 10 months now?
Mm-hmm. Well, Hamas isn't even at the table. I mean, it's Israeli sends a delegation and shows up, and there's the interlocutors of Qatar and Egypt, but you don't have anyone really in Hamas leadership at the table, and that's one of the reasons that it's dragged on is everything that is suggested or agreed upon has to then get passed to Sinwar, who's in tunnels somewhere way down below Gaza. By the time the message gets to him, by the time his response happens, usually often weeks have gone by on that. So there are those who say that it is neither in Netanyahu's or Sinwar's interest to resolve this conflict and to have a ceasefire. Netanyahu and many Israeli pundits are analyzing this and basically how continued conflict serves him, and even though he's deeply unpopular, the fact of being a leader in wartime is kind of stringing him along through this unpopularity and delaying the time that he's going to be accountable for what happened on October 7th, the failures of October 7th that led to all this, and on Sinwar's part, he knows that basically Israel will not agree to anything that doesn't involve the complete dismantling of Hamas's military infrastructure and continued leadership. So basically for him, a ceasefire is suicide. So he's not motivated to do it either. So, there's pressure, but until either Sinwar or Netanyahu, and presumably both, see it in their own interest to end this thing, which everybody wants, including the Israeli people and including certainly, though there's no polling, the people of Gaza, I don't see it happening.
How much is the continued pressure on Israel to make sure that the hostages are returned from their captivity by Hamas? How much is that affecting things? Because speaking to sort of Israeli friends who worry that actually that there is now a sort of slight vilification of the hostage families sort of for pushing, for pressurising for their loved ones to be brought home. I mean, where does that play into the whole very complicated situation?
Well, the vilification, such as it stands, is coming from the Netanyahu camp, who has said implicitly and explicitly, basically, that overall, the destruction of Hamas and the prevention of another October 7th and the saving of many lives, the classic trolley problem of, do you sacrifice a few people for the good of saving the lives of many? That's been their position. They've, kind of not been explicit about it because it's a terrible thing to say that hostages are expendable, but their actions have shown that for them, the hostages are expendable. So obviously their families are very upset and worried and angry about, furious, in fact, of what the government is doing. I mean, these are citizens who were literally kidnapped from their homes. We're not even talking about, soldiers who were fighting and taken as prisoners of war. We're talking about people who were taken from their homes or taken from a music festival. So they can't believe, and huge amounts of the Israeli public can't believe that getting them home hasn't been for 10 months the top priority or a high priority of the Israeli government over the priority of winning and triumphing in this military conflict.
Alison Kaplan-Sommer, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Briefing live from Zurich. Now, there are reports of serious assaults by Russia on Ukraine this morning, with an especially heavy air attack on Kyiv. Joining me now for an update from Chernivtsi in Ukraine is Monocle's Ukraine correspondent Olga Tokaryuk. Welcome, Olga.
Hello, Emma.
Thank you so much for joining us. May I ask if things are safe enough at the moment for you where you are?
Well, luckily, I'm in the region of Ukraine that was spared by this really huge Russian attack that happened this morning from 6 a.m. And in the next several hours, Russia launched about 100 missiles and 100 drones on 15 Ukrainian regions. We know now that at least 5 people have been killed and at least 17 injured. And the Ukrainian authorities said that Russia was targeting specifically energy infrastructure of Ukraine, that several important energy power plants were damaged or destroyed. And this is confirmed also by blackouts that followed immediately after these attacks. Blackouts are experienced by residents of various parts of Ukraine, Kyiv, Lviv, basically in all regions of Ukraine. There are blackouts and also shortage of drinking water. Basically, the water supply has been interrupted because it relies on electricity as well.
How much has Ukraine been taken by surprise by this? Reports that are coming out from Kyiv is that, up until now, Kyiv has been able to not necessarily enjoy, but maintain a reasonably untroubled way of life, and this has really taken people aback.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily agree with that, because there was another really big Russian attack on Kyiv in early July. You might remember when Children's Hospital was targeted and partially destroyed. So this is something similar, although as from what we know at this moment, and the consequences are still emerging, Russians mostly targeted energy infrastructure, and in Kyiv region, several important energy power plants were hit. So from the information that we have so far, it seems that it was not the capital, the main target. This attack was really spread all over Ukraine, Kyiv, Lviv, Ivano-Frankivsk, Odessa, various cities of Ukraine, and that it was not entirely unexpected either, because the Ukrainian government has warned that Russians were stockpiling missiles and drones for another attack on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Also on Saturday, Ukraine celebrated its Independence Day, and various embassies warned their residents that another big Russian missile and drone attack is likely. So this is what happened.
There are pleas from Ukraine once again for better air defence resources. The Ukrainian Chief of Staff has asked to be allowed to use long-range weapons on targets inside Russia. Once again, the plea is coming to the international community.
Yes, exactly. So both President Zelensky and Minister of Foreign Affairs Kuleba have issued statements in response to this Russian attack, calling for 2 things from Ukraine's Western partners. First, to allow Ukraine to strike targets deep inside Russian territory, to destroy these facilities from which Russia is launching these missiles and drones. And second, they also called to give permission to countries that are NATO members and that are bordering Ukraine to allow them to strike these targets from their territory, for example, to Poland or to Romania. They see when Russians are launching drones in the direction of the west of Ukraine, potentially would be able to down those missiles and drones with their air defense. But this permission so far has not been granted, and Ukrainians are asking for that to be allowed and are saying this will not be an escalation.
For the last few weeks, we have seen a Ukrainian incursion into Russia, which has just shown what Ukraine is capable of, and has clearly shown up the Russian ability to defend their own territory, and has pointed the spotlight once again at Vladimir Putin. How much do you believe that today's attack is seen as a retaliatory gesture for what appears to be Ukraine's great progress made in the last few weeks?
I don't think so, because this is not something new. There has been this great disparity in, what Ukraine can do and what Russia can do. Russia basically has a free hand It can launch missile and drone attacks on Ukraine without any accountability. Ukraine is only able to defend itself on the battlefield, right? Either in Ukraine or now also in this Russian territory that is bordering Ukraine. So this huge disparity is still there. These attacks have happened in the past. This attack was predictable. It was predicted that Russia will target Ukrainian energy infrastructure before the cold season comes. So I don't think there is a direct correlation. What the Ukraine's Kursk operation has demonstrated, though, that there are no red lines, actually, that the West, many Western countries are so afraid of, that Ukraine managed to take the war into Russian territory. And this didn't cause any serious escalation. And this gives ground now to Ukrainian officials, to president and foreign minister, to call on Ukraine's Western partners to allow Ukraine to conduct this operation deeper inside Russian territory, to use their weapons to target objects and military bases on Russian territory.
Olga Tokaryuk in Chernivtsi in Ukraine, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. We'll get more analysis of the situation in tonight's edition of the Monocle Daily with Andrew Muller live from London. That's at 1800 in London, at 1900 if you're listening here in Zurich. You're listening to The Briefing with me, Emma Nelson, coming to you from Dufaulstrasse 90 here in Zurich. The time is 15 minutes past 1. Let's have a quick look at the rest of today's news headlines. Here's Henry Rees-Sheridan.
Thank you, Emma. Gunmen have killed at least 22 people in southwest Pakistan after forcing them out of their vehicles and checking their identity. The attack happened overnight on a highway in Balochistan province, where security forces are battling sectarian, ethnic and separatist violence. The armed men allegedly checked identity documents and singled out those from Punjab to be shot. The Baloch Liberation Army, a militant group, has claimed responsibility for the attacks. The messaging app Telegram has said its CEO, Pavel Durov, has nothing to hide after he was detained in France on Saturday. Mr. Durov was arrested in an airport north of Paris under a warrant for offences related to the app. The investigation is reportedly about insufficient moderation, with Mr. Durov accused of failing to take steps to curb criminal uses of Telegram. And a right to disconnect rule has come into effect in Australia. The new law allows employees to ignore communications after hours if they choose to, without fear of being punished by their bosses. More than 20 countries, mainly in Europe and Latin America, have similar rules. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Emma.
Thank you very much indeed, Henry. You're with The Briefing, coming to you from Dufaulstrasse 90 here in Zurich. Now, a power struggle has developed between the Indonesian government and the country's highest court over who can or cannot be eligible for elections. Last week, the country's constitutional court set a lower age limit to stop people under the age of 30 from running for regional governorships. It also made it easier for political parties to nominate candidates. Well, within 24 hours, Parliament had voted to reverse the ruling, and it prompted widespread protests. Well, Jackie Baker is Principal Fellow at Murdoch University's Indo-Pacific Research Centre. I'm delighted to say she joins me on the line now from Perth. Thank you so much for joining us. A very good afternoon to you, Jackie.
Nice to be here with you, Emma.
Just explain to us, it is a complicated situation, isn't it? So I attempted in a moment just to try and explain what was going on. But could you just recap the nature of this struggle?
You did a great job, actually, Emma. So the Constitutional Court last Wednesday made a ruling based on a couple of challenges launched by a few political parties about the upcoming regional head elections. So for your viewers, I'm sure they have already heard that there was a national election in February where Prabowo Subianto won the election. Now we're going through another round of elections for governor and all the regional heads of the Indonesian government. So this is about the rules for the regional election. And those rules were being challenged because on one side we were seeing these super PAC coalitions of parties coming together and nominating one candidate. So in many regions, you weren't getting any political choice. You were literally just having one candidate being put forward. And the other issue that was being raised was that the government under Joko Widodo was advocating for a reduction in the age limit. And that was seen specifically to benefit Jokowi's son, Kaisang Pangarap, who is under the current rules is too young to run. So they were trying to make some small adjustments to enable him to run. It's also worth remembering that Jokowi's other son, his eldest son, Gibran Rakabuming Raka, has already made it to the vice presidential position. So this is about the younger son getting a position in regional government.
It's an interesting situation given the fact that Joko Widodo has to step down in a couple of months because he can't stand again for election, and a successor has been nominated and found, and it looks as if Indonesia is ready to move forward. So how much is this an outright attempt by Joko Widodo to retain a grip on power, albeit indirectly?
That's absolutely what's happening. And it seems to be that Jokowi is building his own dynastic rule with providing his sons for opportunities at the highest levels of government, but also across the government. So many of the Jokowi supporters, so for instance, the police commissioner for Central Java was being nominated. He was seen as an ally of Jokowi, Jokowi's brother-in-law in North Sumatra. So throughout the local government, there were allies of Jokowi being nominated for local government. And so Jokowi was really being seen as trying to spread his influence in that way. I think it's worth remembering that a lot of governments or outgoing administrations get nervous about what's going to get picked over by the incoming administration. Will there be accusations of corruption? Will their legacy be tainted? Will their political enemies come after them? And so I think there has been something of a concern amongst the national elite that they need to shore themselves up politically as they go out in order to ward off any political attacks.
Tell us a little bit more about the scale of the reaction to this, because there were protests right across Indonesia, weren't there?
Absolutely. It was an incredible moment of political organisation and civil society sort of hitting the streets in anger over the proposed revised election law, which was being put forward by Parliament. Now, that revised election law had suddenly materialised out of nowhere, had been put together within a few hours and was going to get passed in 24 hours. So once that became clear at about 5 p.m. on Jakarta time, within the next 12 hours, Indonesian civil society organisations, its ordinary people, its student bodies, its academics, its actors, its comedians hit the streets across about 14 major cities, protesting in front of Parliament against this proposed revised election law, which effectively annulled or ignored the ruling from the Constitutional Court.
What does this say, therefore, about people power in Indonesia?
It's a really, really good question, because under the Jokowi government, we've seen numerous efforts by civil society organisations and students to protest Jokowi and his government. Jokowi is a developmentalist president. He's quite an authoritarian figure at from some perspectives. And under Jokowi, we have seen serious attacks on civil society and a degrading of Indonesia's democracy. Nonetheless, Jokowi remained incredibly popular. And it's only with this last sort of foul step, basically, attempting to get his younger son into the political competition for regional head, that people just seemed to be the straw that broke people's back. And people hit the streets. And it's one of the few people power success stories that we can talk about of the last 10 years. So I think everybody's hoping that people power is back in Indonesia.
And tell us finally, when you place the executive or parliament versus the courts, who is likely to win here?
This was the question we were unclear about. I mean, in any normal country, the Constitutional Court sort of presides over everything, and a Constitutional Court ruling should be the basis for any legislation. However, in this case, we saw the legislature, the national legislature, in total ignorance of the law, try to revise a law that completely neglected the Constitutional Court ruling. So basically, Indonesia for 24 hours was in uncharted waters and in a major constitutional crisis.
Jackie Baker, thank you so much for joining us from Perth on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Briefing, coming to you from Zurich. It's just nudging 13:24 here in Zurich, 12 23 in London. Now, several states in Germany head to the polls in the coming weeks, and emerging as genuine contenders on the ballot paper are the so-called anti-war parties. These are political groupings who, for whatever reason, want the Russian invasion of Ukraine to end and do not support the current German government's continued backing of Kyiv. Well, joining me from our London studios, Quentin Peel, Associate Fellow of the Europe Programme at Chatham House in London. A very good afternoon to you, Quentin. Good to have you on the programme.
Hi, Emma. Very nice to chat.
So just explain to us a little bit about who these political groupings are and what they want exactly.
Well, the main one is the far-right Alternative for Germany, the AfD, which is running first in the state of Thuringia, Thüringen, in East Germany, one of the smaller German Länder, and one where the AfD was already actually the largest party at the previous elections. But they could come first in all three of the East German states that are coming up. And it's not just the war in Ukraine, it's a general feeling of dissatisfaction, above all with immigration. That relates to Ukrainian refugees, as well as to others from countries like Syria and Afghanistan. But that's really the feeling, I think. The other party that has come out of nowhere, really, is called the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht. It's named after and for Sarah Wagenknecht, an East German, hard-left activist, but she is what she describes as a conservative left-winger. She actually has adopted really quite conservative policies on things like anti-immigration and pro-Russia on Ukraine, or at least pro a Russian-style peace settlement in Ukraine. And so she's playing a very interesting game of having a foot in both camps. And she already, from nothing, the party was launched effectively just last January, is now running in double figures, sort of 13%. So between the two of these parties, at least in some places, they could end up with a far larger vote than all the traditional German parties, the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats.
So you have this far left and far right and sort of like the populist spirit driving these two arguably opposing parties, but bringing them together is a sort of a German-Russian connection and almost a warmth for Moscow.
Yes, and it's really very difficult to explain, because you would think that there would actually be almost a feeling of relief in much of East Germany at having got rid of Soviet occupation more than 30 years ago and sort of welcoming the much better living standards that they are enjoying as part of a unified Germany. But having said that, there's still a sort of nagging nostalgia for the old world, because I think a lot of people in Eastern Germany felt that they lost part of their identity with unification, that the things that they did do quite well, like good community standards, strong sense of community and egalitarianism, those sort of things that they had under the communist system, they were all chucked out of the window along with much of their industry, and they've never really quite come back to feeling confident about themselves. That's why they feel just a bit bloody-minded and rebellious.
What is driving all this, given the fact that it is, 35 years, I think, if my memory serves me right, since the Berlin Wall fell. So those who were, 35 when that fell will now be 70. I mean, where is this fresh impetus for a sort of an East-West divide to come from?
Well, it's really been there a bit all along, that unification has never worked quite as well as people hoped and expected. Do you remember in the good old days when Helmut Kohl said, we're going to have a blooming landscape with unification? He was hugely optimistic. And West Germany poured money into East Germany to actually revive the economy there. But somehow the feeling in East Germany was there was always a chip on people's shoulders. They always rather resented the paternalism of the West Germans and the fact that all the top jobs actually went to West Germans. So I think that there was that feeling, well, we have lost part of ourselves. And I was talking to a very good friend of mine from East Germany this morning, and I said, look, why is this swing happening apparently to the far right and the far left? And she said, look, I think we felt we'd lost something with unification, and now with all the refugees from Ukraine that seem to be all over the place, and an economy that's in trouble nationally, slow growth, high prices, all of those things are contributing to the feeling that we're in danger of losing things again. And I think they just rather resent, if you like, the arrogance of Berlin in saying we offer the only way to do things right.
How much could this alter the German government's approach to its continued support for Ukraine and indeed any forthcoming elections?
Well, it's really wide open. The truth is, of course, that foreign policy, and therefore Ukraine and the war in Ukraine, has absolutely nothing to do with the agenda of these German federal states. They are responsible for education, for health, for roads and local things. They're not responsible for foreign policy. But Sarah Wagenknecht, for example, is basically saying if she's going to go into government with any other party, the likelihood possibly might be to go into government with the Christian Democrats in the state of Saxony. She would say, OK, you've got to support a peace deal with Russia in Ukraine and a slowdown in German support for Ukraine if I'm going to join you in power. And that would be very embarrassing for the Christian Democrats, who are very keen to be winning next year's elections in Germany as a whole, on a platform of strong support for Ukraine. So it would put them in a very difficult position.
Quentin Peel, thank you as ever for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Briefing, live from Zurich. Finally, on today's programme from Dufourstrasse 90, I cast my gaze towards Midori House in London, where we find Fernanda Augusta Pacheco in the studio, ready to go through the papers. Faye, this is going to be interesting, considering I can't see the papers that you've brought in, so you're going to have to be very good at describing things to me today. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I'll be very... And by the way, Emma, can I tell you some little breaking news from Switzerland, by the way?
Go for it.
This is unexpected, but...
Don't make me look as if I'm not across things here in Zurich.
Absolutely not. It's very breaking news. Friday at 10 a.m. Zurich time, we'll find out who is going to be the winning city for Eurovision next year, Basel or Geneva.
Believe me, it's all they're talking about. Seriously, it is literally all they're talking about. And our money, we think, is going to be on Basel.
I kind of was hoping for Geneva, but honestly, please, people from Basel, don't get angry with me. I will be happy with either.
We were only doing it because Basel geographically is slap bang in the middle of things, and it's also very good at holding things like Art Basel. And you can go into Germany, you can go to France, you can move around quite quickly. That said, Geneva is next door to France as well, so it's all everywhere. But that was just the sort of like the chatter by the Bardi in Zurich. We'll sort of wait with bated breath on Friday.
Good. Well, sorry to say this because, of course, I have some other stories from Brazil and the newspapers that you're so curious about, Emma.
Go for it.
The first one is the main story of O Estado de São Paulo today. It's a really interesting story, Emma, because a lot of numbers here that I didn't know. Basically, it's talking about the terrible state of the regional airlines market in Brazil. So basically, what they mean with regional is the following. So is those very small airlines that attend smaller cities that are outside of the Brazilian state capitals. And the reason why they're investigating that, of course, after the accident with Voe Pass that happened in the state of São Paulo a few weeks ago, that's from one of the three only remaining regional airlines brands in Brazil. That's a really shocking number, Emma, because there were so many statistics. In the 50s, 400 Brazilian cities were attended by regional airlines, and now it's only 50 to 70. It's a market that is quite decadent, and I'm not talking about aviation in general. The big capitals are busy as ever, but if you live in a small town in Brazil and you want to connect to another small town, you are in trouble, because those airlines, there's been a lot of bankruptcies as well. Just look at Voe Pass. That airline is in deep trouble after the accident that happened as well.
I mean, when you have something like Voe Pass and it has its fatal flight, that does damage the reputation of an air company for a very, very long time, until it can be absolutely shown that it has sort of sorted its house out. I mean, what prospect for those people who find themselves unable to get across the country? It's
really, really bad prospects, because, as I said, Voe Pass is just one of 3. That's an incredible number for a country as massive as Brazil. The other 2 is Abaeté and Azul Conecta. And Emma, there's a lot of challenges as well, because I was reading as well that fuel for local flights, they are more expensive because they're away from the big centers. So, distribution of it's much harder. And there's a lack of public policies to help, those airlines as well. So it is very challenging, and it's a shame. It's making Brazil a less connected country internally.
Tell us about an article that you picked up in O Globo, which talks about the Brazil, like so many other countries, is having to manage an aging population. But Brazil is getting older faster, isn't it?
Much faster than predicted, Emma. So by 2042, the Brazilian population in general will start to decrease. It was expected that this would happen only in 2070, not the case anymore. And in some cities, or states, Rio de Janeiro, for example, it's going to start happening in 2028. So it's quite interesting, because Brazil had a demographic bonus for a while, and it did help the country to grow. Not as much as expected. In other countries, this was even better. So there's a lot of concerns about the country, about aging. And Brazil, it's interesting that, of course, we're definitely not like Europe, who have, different age. I think Europe is an older continent. But Brazil spent so much money with Social Security. We will definitely need to rethink that. So there's been a lot of concerns. It's an interesting article, because look at the US. I was looking. Apparently, their population will only start to decrease in 2100. So Brazil's in a very much different category. I mean, as I said, in some states, even next year, in fact, there will be some population decreases already.
Fernanda Augusta Pacheco, thank you so much for joining us in the studio in Midori House. And that's all the time we have for today's edition of The Briefing, live from Zurich. Many thanks to all my guests, and to the producer Christy O'Grady. Our researcher is Monica Lillis, and our studio manager Mariella Bevan. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time, but for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening, and have a great week.